Yeah, thanks. Okay.
Okay, Christy, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, glad to be here. Thanks for the intro, Stephen. As he said, my name is Kristy Bredin, and I'm an herbalist working here in the San Juan Islands for the past decade. I've studied with a lot of different herbalists throughout this country and even up in BC, but I've worked a lot with Ryan Drum, who is known as our local wild plants expert and seaweed expert, one of the few seaweed experts in the country. He's semi-retired, and I've taken on a lot of his work, and I offer various workshops in the area, an apprenticeship program, and I also wild craft herbs and sell them to individuals and companies. That's Ryan Drum's business that he's passed on to me. So I feel really grateful to be doing this work. And again, I'm happy to be here sharing with you all some about the different plants that grow in the different ecosystems here in the islands. I'm just gonna get my PowerPoint up here. Let's see. Okay. Okay, I think that should look good, but let me know if not. So as we begin talking about these different plants, this lecture comprises many different wild plants that grow here in the islands. Some of them are native, some of them are not native, and as the title suggests, they grow in the field. You'll find them in the fields, in the forest, in the sea. And I don't know what kind of outdoor access you both have, but many of these plants you can see around town, or you might find them in your garden or someone else's garden. So it's fun to be able to explore the area and notice plants that we herbalists use as medicine. So a few things before we start about working with plants as herbal medicine. I like to teach about the many different ways we can engage with the plants in the world around us, because some people may feel intimidated about eating wild plants or working with them as medicine, because it can be tricky. And of course, there are poisonous plants in our region that we need to be super keenly aware about before ingesting from them. And then there's sustainability issues with some wild native plants, if it's okay to harvest or not, because they're a limited resource. But there's many ways we can engage with our ecosystem and learn from these plants. It doesn't have to be eating them or working with them as medicine. We can take observations of them. Many of my teachers have taught about just sitting with plants, spending time with them. It's a relaxing thing to sit with a tree in the woods and just spend some time meditating. You can also spend time drawing plants. That's a great way to learn about them and how they're structured, and notice details about them. And spending time with plants and observing plants at different times of year is a great way to learn about their life cycles and how they grow. So I really encourage folks to get out there and be interactive with their environment, because I feel like it's an important thing for us to do now as we learn to become sustainable stewards in our ecosystem, and to kind of engage with our ecosystem as we once did, as a part of it. So in this sense, I talk to people about being becoming indigenous again, because as we're seeing here, we're going to look at some plants that are of European origin, some plants that are native here, some plants that are native to the whole northern hemisphere of the world. So there's a lot of crossover when it comes to plants. And there's definitely invasive plants in our ecosystem that are also medicine. They're also serving a function in the ecosystem, kind of coming in where there's been a hole for them to create a role for themselves. And so I feel like we're at a point in time where we also have a lot of native and non-native people, especially out in the Pacific Northwest, where colonization has been a relatively recent thing, where we're learning how to become indigenous again, to kind of grow into the place where we live. And I think it's important work. And in that work, we want to also acknowledge and respect the people whose land that we live on, and that have come before us, and from whom we gain a lot of the understanding of especially local plants and local plant medicines. And so if you're getting into learning how to harvest wild plants, it's important to be clear on identifying them in the field, learning the way to do that that's best for you, whether you're able to go on a plant walk with myself or some other local wild plant folks, or just getting some field guides. It's good to get a couple of field guides. There's the Plants of the Pacific Northwest Coast is one of the best ones for our region. But plants look very different depending on the time of year that you're seeing them and the circumstances in which they're growing. So seeing one picture of a plant in one book makes it very hard to necessarily correlate it to what you have or what you're seeing out in the field. As I said, you want to be super aware of the toxic plants in our area. If you're interested in foraging or making plant medicine, and then always be over 100% sure of your identification before actually working with the plant in that way. At the same time, it's important to make sure you have permission to be harvesting plants where you are. If it's on your own land, that's an easy thing, but in our parks, there's different rules about whether or not to be harvesting plants there. And unless you're super attuned to the cycle of the plants and where they're growing, a rule of thumb for sustainable harvesting is to not harvest more than 10% of a stand of plants that you come across that you're interested in working with. So we're going to start with plants that we might find in the field or the garden. And the first one we're talking about is yarrow. Achillea millefolium is the Latin name. It's good to cross-reference Latin names when you're learning how to identify plants in the wild, because that will give you a clear identification if you have the correct species. So this is a perennial that grows in all the temperate regions of the Northern Hemisphere. So it's an indigenous plant here, but it's also native to Europe and many parts of the world. So this plant has a great long history of being used by many different peoples for a really long time. You'll see it in flower in June or July here in the San Juan Islands. And it's about 1 to 3 feet high. I've seen plants in and around East Sound. So it's in kind of grassy areas, so you might come across it there. And the flowers, or the leaves rather, are hairy. They're very feather-like. The Spanish name for yarrow translates as little feather that heals. So that's one way to identify it. And the flowers are grayish white. Sometimes you'll see a little bit of pink or yellow. There's some cultivated ornamental yarrows that this plant can hybridize with. The ornamental yarrows, I don't know if they're medicinal or not. I would probably compare the smell of them to decide if they had a potent medicine, but I only really work with the white native yarrow. And this is one that you can plant in your gardens very easily. It will cultivate well. If you're identifying yarrow in the wild, it could potentially be confused with a poisonous plant we have in the region, poison hemlock. So this is one you want to be clear on. Poison hemlock grows there's a lot of it in Anacortes by the ferry landing in that little walk there, but it's got big purple splotchy patches on its stems, and it has no hair on it. Some of the other plants like yarrow or wild carrot, which looks similar, they have hairy stems and stalks. But just one to be mindful with if you're interested in identifying it and harvesting it. So yarrow has some medicinal chemicals in it that are used in certain ways. So it's a bitter herb. So many of our bitter herbs are used for digestion. They're best taken before meals because this helps to stimulate a lot of gastric secretions and get the whole digestive process going. So often people will take bitters before meals. Yarrow has a high tannin content. Tannins are astringent. They tighten tissue. So we'll run into some other herbs that also have tannins. They also bind to the protein coat on viruses and bacteria and kill viruses and bacteria. So black tea is another herb that you might know that has high tannins. And for example, people dealing with digestive infection could take strong black tea, and it would potentially kill any bacterial pathogen that has entered the digestive tract. Yarrow is also high in volatile oils, so that's something that you smell. The highly aromatic plants that have a strong smell, often that's a volatile oil component, and the volatile oils are generally speaking antibacterial. So if a plant has a strong smell like that it probably has some antibacterial properties. Yarrow has several healing properties. We often talk about plants in terms of cooling or heating. That's kind of comes from Chinese medicine. And so yarrow is one plant that can be cooling to hot conditions in the body. When you think of like inflammation or red conditions where there's a red appearance, yarrow can be cooling for that. And so it's not surprising, it's also an anti-inflammatory. As I mentioned, with those volatile oils, it's got antimicrobial properties. So yarrow, the root and the leaves especially, can be used for tooth infections. And any herb that's an antimicrobial with high volatile oils are going to help with bacterial infections in the lungs and the kidneys, because that's the pathway through which the volatile oils are excreted in the body. As a digestive aid, as a bitter herb, also as a carminative herb with all those aromatics, a carminative herb is an herb that you use after digestion to help with gas. And so yarrow has both properties and can help with the whole digestive process. But it's a little hard on the liver taken internally. So yarrow is not really one for long-term use. You could use it temporarily for digestive issues for like a week in small amounts, but generally it's not a digestive herb you would use all the time. It's more often used as an acute herb, for things like if you feel like you have a cold coming on. It's also a diaphoretic, as you can see, which means it increases sweating, so it helps to move a fever through the body. That's what it's often used for a lot. And one of the biggest deal that Yarrow does is it's anti-hemorrhagic. It helps to increase blood clotting. And so this happens internally or externally. It has a regulatory effect on the blood. So as we'll see here, Yarrow is known as a great wound healer in many of the different cultures that have worked with this plant. It's been found growing on ancient battlefield sites. It was known as soldier's woundwort during the Civil War because this is one that has been used by many people to stop bleeding. And you can do this by doing a poultice, which means you take the leaves and you break them up and you put them on the wound, and it will stop the bleeding pretty immediately. You can also chew them up and put them on the wound. Many herbalists like to do what they call a spit poultice because your spit also has tissue healing properties and other elements of it that are actually medicinal. And Yarrow will also work as a powder to stop bleeding. And with those antibacterial properties, it is also a really profound herb for preventing infection in wounds. When taken internally, Yarrow can help to elevate your mood. Again, it's not one that's used regularly. But many of these herbs too, especially the ones that have these volatile oils, you can absorb them through your skin. So Ryan Drum and I would be out harvesting yarrow and many times get very euphoric doing it because by handling a lot of the plant material, you end up absorbing some of that medicine through your skin. An interesting yarrow has been used for divination in various cultures. There was the British Isles tradition of tickling the nose or placing a yarrow leaf under one's pillow at night for insight. And then the Chinese form of divination, the I Ching, uses yarrow stalks as a kind of a throwing to gain information. I think we talked about most of these things, generally speaking, in terms of more specific medicinal uses of yarrow. As I said, various stages of cold and flu it can be helpful. Any sort of as kind of a blood tonic herb for short-term use. And with those tannins and antimicrobial properties, it would be a great throat gargle if you have an infection coming on in the throat. It's also a traditional one used for brewing beer. The word wort, which is not applied to yarrow, but there's some plants like mugwort, St. John's wort, means it was used in making the wort to brew beer. So now beer is mainly made of hops and barley, but in the past, many different plants have been used to make beer, and yarrow is one that has traditionally been used for that purpose. So our next one that we might find in the field is chickweed, and this is a European native that has ended up here. This is a tiny plant that you might find growing in grasses and fields anywhere, or in your garden or someone else's garden. So it grows very close to the ground, just a few inches tall. And it's got these egg-shaped leaves and a single line of hair running up along the stem, which is pretty easy to notice when you look close. It's a very it's known for its moistening qualities. So if you crush it up or if you were to taste them, there'd be a lot of juices in it. And this is an herb that is used in European folk herbalism, has a long history of use there. It's an ancient plant, been around for a long time. As you can see, there were some fossils found from plants growing a long time ago, chickweed plants. It's a wild edible. You can put it in salads, the leaves and the flowers. And it's most often used topically, though. So it's most often used in different ointments or salve formulas. It can be used as a fresh poultice, like we were talking about with the yarrow. Even the tincture can be used topically. And it's specifically really good for drawing out splinters or glass shards or dealing with ingrown hairs or cystic acne. It really has an affinity for dealing with hard lumps and drawing out toxins or materials that you have in your skin that shouldn't be there, like a splinter or a glass shard. It's amazing. There are a few herbs that do this. If you keep them applied to a splinter, they will actually draw out the splinter. So because this is a cooling, soothing, moistening herb, it's often used in hot conditions as well, like eczema, psoriasis, on sunburn, inflamed sore eyes or hemorrhoids. So it can be used in those ways as well. And that's why it's often put in salve or other ointment mixtures. It also has antiviral and antibacterial properties. So because it's a great skin herb, you could use it for or try it on a bacterial or viral infection that's manifesting through the skin. Something like shingles. And it's also a great herb for dissolving, as I mentioned, cystic growths, or it has traditionally been used for certain types of tumors and cancers, or swollen parts of the body. It can help reduce swelling as well. This next one, plantain, not to be confused with the banana plantain, is one that you'll also see in many grassy areas. It grows throughout the world. There's a couple of different species. There's the lance leaf plantain, which I've pictured here and in the other slides. That's the one I mainly use. There's also Plantago major, which is the broad-leafed one, and the leaves are kind of rounder. Both can be used, and different herbalists use them, sometimes distinguish, and one is better for different preparations than others. But this is another highly regarded wound healing plant by many different cultures that have used it where they live. And it's a pretty small one. It grows year round here. It grows up to 4 inches, tends to grow in hard compacted soil. Generally we're working with the leaves in some sort of external wound preparation, but the seeds are also known as psyllium seeds. It's a different species of plantain. The seeds of this plantain are also edible. But the seeds are very mucilaginous and they're a bulking fiber, so they're used as a fiber for digestive issues. So like yarrow and chickweed, this is one we might look to as a poultice, especially as a spit poultice. My one teacher, Robin Rose Bennett, used to call it a green band-aid. And it's high in tannins as well, so that astringency will kind of help with bleeding, not in the way that yarrow does, but it will help heal wounds and prevent infection. It's one I'll use with yarrow in a powder on different wounds, that I found really effective for even some deep wounds that I've gotten, to help expedite the healing and prevent infection. It's got anti-inflammatory properties as well. So there's a constituent in it, allantoin, that's kind of mucilaginous and soothing. So it tends to help with inflammatory issues of the lower respiratory tract and digestive issues. But also allantoin has tissue healing properties. It helps promote the healing of tissues. So whether you're improving your gut integrity or healing a wound, plantain can be helpful for that. This is another plant that has drawing properties, so will draw out toxins or poisons. There's a story among herbalists about an Anishinaabe herbalist who saved a woman's life who got bit by a black widow spider, and they did a plantain poultice on it, and she survived the bite and healed from it. Same with like bee and wasp stings. There's an herbalist I know on the East Coast who was out on a plant walk, and a woman got stung by a bee on her tongue and was allergic, didn't have her EpiPen, and he had her chew on plantain, and her symptoms had reduced greatly by the time they made it back to the cars where she was able to get her EpiPen. So really a profound plant at reducing allergic responses and swelling when it comes to insect bites. And same as chickweed, you can do a poultice and draw out splinters or glass shards as well. Yeah, this is a great one for poison ivy or poison oak rash, which I've dealt with several years when I was living on the East Coast, having a poison ivy rash. And those conditions are pretty tricky to heal because they're both wet and dry at the same time. A lot of the herbs out there and treatments like clay dry it out too much. And then it gets all hard and cracked. But plantain seems to have the right balance for working with that kind of rash and infection. So really a great medicine. As far as using the psyllium husks that are from a different species of plantain, you can buy them in the store. They're used a lot in gluten-free baking where you're looking for a binding agent. But that soluble fiber can be helpful in lowering cholesterol, as well as perhaps helping to regulate your blood sugar because it slows the digestive process. Dandelion, this is one of our favorite plants, and many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with this plant. A lot of people might look to this plant as a weed that they want to eliminate from their gardens, but actually it's a really profound medicine, a native to Europe, but brought here to the Americas pretty early on. And the name Taraxacum, its Latin name, is translated as disorder, or to heal a disorder, or a remedy for a disorder or disturbance. And really, dandelion can be um, um, a whole body kind of herb, tonic herb. Let's see if there's anything else I wanted to say here. Often it's an edible plant. You can eat the leaves and the flowers. The leaves are quite bitter. The flowers, if you take the petals off of the head, they can be sweeter tasting. I would probably put a little bit of both in salads, but the root is often used as a medicine, and we'll talk a little bit about the differences between those. But every part of the plant is really nourishing and used as food or medicine. If you're harvesting the root, often the herbalist will harvest in the fall or the spring, because the thought is that you want to be harvesting a plant at the time of year when its energy is in that part. So once the leaves are out and the flowers are out, then the plant's putting its energy into the leaves and flowers. And so in the fall, the roots end up storing a lot of their food for the winter. So they're high in inulin, which is known as a prebiotic these days. A lot of people are taking inulin with their probiotics because it helps feed the good bacteria in the gut. And in the spring, the root is more bitter. So again, like other bitter herbs, you might want to use it for digestion. This is another cooling herb. It's also drying. And the bitters are used, the root is used for digestive issues, whereas the leaves are more often used as medicine for the urinary tract. They have a diuretic effect. And dandelion is also known as an alternative in that it helps to navigate kind of contradictory indications in the body, or many different things going on in the body. As I said, it can be used as a tonic herb to balance out different systems of the body. It's particularly good for encouraging the lymph movement, and it's often used in conditions that may be liver or lymph related, but come out through the skin, like eczema, acne, allergic reactions. So often herbalists will use herbs like dandelion that are helping to support the liver for elimination, and that helps alleviate some skin conditions. Dandelion is known as a restorative and rejuvenating plant. Sometimes when we explore plants, like I was talking about in the beginning, if you're just observing plants, seeing how they grow, seeing where they grow, we can learn a lot about their medicine. So, dandelion grows in really tenaciously in a lot of places. It penetrates asphalt. You'll see it growing out of sidewalks in the cities. So really a great plant teacher about strength, courage, and stamina. And those bright yellow blossoms, some herbalists work with the flowers as an antidepressant medicine, or to help people see light in the darkness. Dandelion flowers close up when it gets dark or when it's nighttime. So this plant teaches us metaphorically how to open up in the light, and how to close and be within ourselves during dark times. Now I'm going to talk about a couple of my favorite plants of the forest. and then get into seaweeds, and hopefully we'll have a little bit of time left for questions. This plant, coral root orchid, grows in our woods here. It was over harvested east of the Mississippi, so we're lucky to still have it as a relatively abundant plant here. There's a striped one and a spotted one. I have the spotted one pictured here, but you may have seen the striped coral root orchid in the woods. And what's interesting about this plant and the next plant I'm going to talk about is that they're non-chlorophyll containing plants, or they're saprophytes. So they have to have a relationship to derive their nutrients. And that's how they've evolved. So with coral root, it has partnered with specific fungal partners that feed off the forest floor biomass, and then it's getting its food through them. There's thought that there's an exchange going on with the coral root providing the fungus with access to carbohydrates. And this is a really delicate plant if you've seen it, but yet it tends to grow in old logging roads and trails in and around here where I live part-time on Waldron Island. You see it a lot on trails because it's got these tiny, tiny seeds. And with that mycelial connection, I think a gentle agitation of the soil helps to connect the seeds with its fungal partners. And so that's a great lesson in a positive engagement between humans and plants. We often think of how humans are negatively impacting our environment, but I think like walking on trails and that general movement of the soil creates growth of new plants like coral root orchid that are dependent on connecting their tiny seeds with the mycelial partners. So you can see these are the roots of the coral root orchid. Part of its name is because the roots really do look like coral. They're kind of like these puzzle piece shaped pieces that fit together. And the main medicines of this is it's a nervine, so it helps to relax the nervous system, especially for it was used by the Salish for children who were too overtired to go to sleep. It can similarly be used for adults who are stressed out and overtired. So it's a really great medicine in that way. It was also used as a diaphoretic, so helping to reduce fevers or move fevers through the body through sweating, or at the end of cold and flus. And as I mentioned here, it's a great teacher for people who are delicate like orchids of how to be graceful and sensitive while living in a prominent place like a trail. So that's what its medicine is about. And then this other one, ghost pipe, is another saprophytic plant that grows in our forests. It grows throughout the northern hemisphere. And I won't take the time to read Barbara Kingsolver's poem, but it really is a beautiful poem that captures the spirit of this plant. I have a few other pictures here. You can get, that's Ryan Drum's hand in there, and you can get a sense of the size of this plant. And it's really stunning to come across this plant in the woods because it's white. It's this shocking white plant. A lot of people think it's a mushroom, but it's actually a plant. And it's got these kind of brain-like masses of roots. And then some of the ghost pipes can be quite pink. I find the pink ones often growing amidst cedar trees, and then some of them can be really dark purple in other places. And what's interesting about this plant as a saprophyte, and why I love this plant so much, is that it's got a slightly different relationship with the mycelium its roots mimic tree roots. And so it's kind of part of this whole network. There's been a lot of recent studies about the mycelial network and how it serves as communication between the trees of the forest and all these other elements, as well as sharing food resources. So the mycelial network connects all the trees in the forest and is sharing information and food. And the ghost pipe kind of sits itself in this circle, pretending to be a tree, and it convinces the mycelium to share its food that way too. So really kind of a fascinating evolution of this plant. And in that way, it's another powerful nervine, particularly for processing overwhelming amounts of information. So if you think about it as this kind of in the midst of a massive amount of information communicated in the forest, it does that for us too. So it helps people if they're dealing with a traumatic situation, if they're dealing with intense physical pain. And what's neat about it is it's not an analgesic. It does not numb pain, but it helps you to step back from the experience and to look at it in a different way and be able to handle it better. So I'm just going to keep going for the sake of time. We just have a couple of seaweeds to talk about, and then I'm happy to go back to any of the plants and answer your questions. But stepping seaside to our great oceans that we live near, seaweeds are these amazing, unique plants that many people don't know about in terms of food. Pretty much all the seaweeds in our area are edible. Some of them don't taste great, but there's not really any poisonous ones to look out for. And they can be great for us. A lot of people here put seaweeds in their garden to supplement with nutrients because they're growing and they have access to a lot of minerals and nutrients that land plants don't have access to because they're in the ocean, where there's things like concentrated iodine and different trace elements that are often difficult to get from other food. And seaweeds have been well studied as potent antiviral plants or highly medicinal plants because they all have these different gels or phycopolymers that help them to maintain moisture, help them to move nutrients in and out of their cells. So they have these unique chemicals that are then a valuable medicine for people as well. And there's different types of seaweed. There's red, green, and brown. It depends on some of it's color based. So some of them do look like their color, but it's also based on which type of phycopolymer they have. So some of the categories might surprise you. A couple of seaweeds that we have around here that might be easy to see. Fucus is a good one. It grows throughout the northern hemisphere, and it's pretty high up in the intertidal. Different seaweeds grow higher up on the beach, and some of them grow in deeper waters. But this is one you might be able to see up on rocks when you're walking the shoreline most of the year, no matter what the tide is doing. And it's a really great seaweed for tissue healing. I've used it a lot with clients for tissue healing internally and externally when you take it. It's a brown seaweed. A lot of the brown seaweeds are good sources of iodine, which is an important nutrient that you can't get from a lot of other food sources. And it's very important for your thyroid health. Fucus also contains thyroid hormones, and so it can help supplement people who might have low thyroid function, but it's not necessarily a replacement if you are on thyroid hormone medication. And this is one I love to take baths with. You could do foot soaks with it too, but seaweed baths are really amazing. They have seaweed baths in Ireland and seaweed bathing traditions elsewhere in the world. Really great nourishing practice for the body and the nervous system if you ever have a chance to do something like that. And our last one is a unique one to our coast, Bullwhip Kelp, which you may have seen if you've been out on the water. It only grows on this side of the Pacific. So I kind of think of it as our totem seaweed. But it grows in these great, beautiful kelp forests. There's a lot of great underwater pictures and footage of the kelp forests. It grows on these long stipes that can be up to 100 feet in length. All seaweeds need to be anchored to some sort of rock substrate, and they tend to grow close to shore because that's where the nutrients are. So the bullwhip kelp has this long stipe that's filled with carbon monoxide to keep it afloat. And that's so the fronds or the long streamers coming off of it can photosynthesize. This is a seaweed that's incredibly high in minerals. It's got 25 to 50% mineral dry weight. So this is one I like to powder up and just use it. It's very salty tasting. It's actually very high in potassium salts. So it's a great one if you're interested in eating seaweeds, but you haven't before and they seem a little scary. It's a pretty tasty one, especially if you like salty things. And it grows pretty deep out in the water, sometimes shoreline. You can wade in and get it, but you can see my students and I are out on boats harvesting it. Then I hang it out on lines to dry. And one of my classes, we made kelp pickles, which a lot of local people like to make with the stipe, and they're pretty delicious as well. So yeah, I'm going to stop my screen share and try to get to some questions while we still have time. Did anyone have any questions? Yeah, Steve.
Just because it's related to the bullwhip. So you said you pickled what did you call the long stalk looking thing?
The stipe. Mm-hmm.
So is that really salty, that part of the seaweed?
It's not as salty as the fronds, which are what I powder up. And the pickle is a vinegar pickle, and we put all these spices in it, so it ends up having a lot of other flavors. Yeah. Anything else come up for anyone while we were talking?
Yes, hi, thank you for doing this.
Sure.
Well, a few years back, I went and did get a small amount of seaweed, and then I dried it on my front area. I strung ropes and dried it outside and then rinsed it later. I'm wondering, are you going to do any kind of field trip on island, maybe next time the weather's warm or whenever the season is? Because I'd really love to do that, to harvest seaweed. And A, B, or C, do we need a permit to do that?
Yeah, good questions. Thanks. It's good to know that some of you are out there doing this stuff. So you do need a license. It's part of the shellfish license, and that's a personal harvesting license that you can get at the outdoor stores here, or you can order online through the Department of Fish and Wildlife. And that's for the year. It's not very expensive. It's like $10 or $15, and you're allowed to harvest up to 10 wet pounds a day of seaweed.
That's a lot of seaweed, isn't it?
It's a lot. It depends. I mean, bullwhip kelp, if you go out and get that, tends to weigh quite a bit if you were to fill a bucket, but most people aren't getting nearly that much. So it ends up being a lot. And I have done walks with the co-op, through the co-op. I would like to revisit doing that again this summer. We've done them in the summer at the low tides. We've just been on hiatus of doing in-person classes because of COVID, but Yeah, seaweeds are a great one to demo, and there's a lot of intricacies with how you end up drying them. Some of them don't tolerate a freshwater rinse, so some of them you would rinse, some of them you wouldn't. So it sounds like you're exploring that, and there's certainly a lot of questions that come up with that. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, if you could just kind of keep me in mind, or if you do something, and I'll look for it at the co-op.
Yeah.
Or the senior center, right? Maybe.
Well, yeah, possibly. Sure.
Thanks.
Yeah, we'll keep you in the loop, Susan.
Yeah.
Oh, hey, thank you. That's Steve, huh?
Yes, nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. I'm just, doing all these different things home, so I'm not public, but yeah, nice to meet you.
You too. And Bruce, or Doug, I'm sorry, did you have a question?
I just wanted to find out if you harvest some of the kelp, you don't remove it from its base and it regenerates itself?
Yeah, that's a good question too, right? So the fronds that you're talking about, if you cut them off, the bullwhip kelp is an annual, so it generally grows from May until sometime in the winter when it gets ripped up. And then it will reseed and grow again the following May. And if you cut it at the fronds and leave some behind, especially early in the season, it will regrow really quickly. That's a really rapid growing seaweed. And many of the seaweeds you want to cut below where they're attached to the rock, and then they will regrow. If you harvest the stipe like we were talking about for pickles, that does end up killing the plant. So you may want to consider if that's worthwhile to do so. But the fronds are definitely sustainable to harvest. Good question.
Anybody else have any questions?
I would just look forward specifically and in general when things can be done at the senior center, and maybe there's some kind of way to have a big canopy outside and people dress really warm for future.
Yeah. Well, if there are no more questions for Christy, then I would like to take this time to just thank you for being here and talking us through all of those wonderful local plants. And everyone, I just want to remind you that we'll be doing this again next month, and Monica Wieland will be speaking. She is from the Orcas Behavior Institute, and she will be talking about the 2 killer whale populations in the Salish Sea. Thank you, Christy, and thank you everyone for joining.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thanks so much. Appreciate that a lot.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.